Okay, starting the next section. And for announcements, this is why you come to class, or at least tune in at the beginning, is this is when I'm going to make announcements. We finished British North America. That means it was time for the test. The test was going to get cut off this morning, but we're going to extend it till Friday because some people missed the announcement. I know I gave you a schedule, first day of class. We're already off schedule. So the only way you're going to know when the tests start is to tune into class. And sometimes, and I know you can miss it. I mean, I know people who were here missed it. So it's okay this time. But when we get to the end of just know that as we get to the end of a section, and since you have a copy of the PowerPoint, you're going to kind of know when we're getting to the end of it, that there will be a test on that section. So be sure you take the British North America test because it's a bigger one. It's a 40-point test. I'm not quite sure why I made it bigger, but it does cover a lot of material. So be sure you take it. And the English Civil War extra credit test is still up also. I'll cut it off on Friday, whenever I remember on Friday. So those are the announcements. I forgot my notes. Well, I didn't forget them. I thought I had them. I told myself yesterday to print a new copy, and I should have. But I thought, no, I'll save the paper. I've already got it, right? Don't have it. So this could be short and sweet. Colonial ways of life. A lot of this is going to be repeated from information that I already told you as we were going through establishing all the colonies. But we're going to go into a little more detail about how they lived, what life was like. Building this new world, you know, we have discussed, it wasn't an empty place. There were people here already. There was a lot of conflict. There was conflict between the explorers and the Indians, between the settlers and the Indians, between the African slaves that were brought in. So essentially you have three big groups. You have the Europeans, the Africans, and the Native Americans. And they're all in conflict at some point, to some level. But at the same time, there's also a level of accommodation and assimilation. The Indians taught a lot of the first settlers, before they realized they weren't going away and they were just going to keep coming, how to plant, how to grow things, how to make things. The planters learned from the slaves. They brought in new ways of doing things. The Indians learned from the settlers. They got guns. They got rum. Maybe not good things, but they learned things. So there's going to be a lot of overlap. And you'll see this, I mean, we still see this in our world. I mean, particularly in West Texas, you have a lot of Spanish influence. There's a lot of Spanish words that we take for granted. They're just part of our language. If I say hacienda, you all know that means a house or a ranch, but it's a place where somebody lives, right? It's in place names. San Angelo is actually Hispanic. And when it became a town, or wanted to become a town, it was an issue because it was originally Santa Angela, but Americans are lazy, so they shortened it to San Angela. But San is a masculine pronoun, Angela is a female name. And the post office wouldn't approve it because it was grammatically incorrect, even though it wasn't even in English. So you have these influences, you have words, you have foods, you have songs, you have things that are brought in by every culture. So even though there's a lot of conflict, there's still a lot of accommodation. This New World saw a massive social migration of Europeans. They came basically, and we're talking after the general starvation time, not the first couple of years of a colony where it's, a survival issue. We're talking after they're established and colonial life is kind of rocking along. The first wave were the Puritans. Around 20,000 Puritans are going to flood into Massachusetts between 1630 and 1641. That's our first massive wave of Europeans. The second are those Royal Cavaliers, those people who supported the king. Most of those went to the south. A lot of those were quite Anglicans or Catholics who were escaping persecution. The third wave is the Quakers. We talked about that with Pennsylvania. The Quakers brought in a lot of diversity because they brought in other non-British groups as well as, there were a lot of Welsh, Welsh or British. They brought in other groups outside. We talked about how Penn had his advertisements printed in German and in Dutch and advertised to the world to come to his colony. So that's your third wave. And the fourth, the largest wave, it's kind of after actually the time we've talked about so far. Between 1717 and 1775, you get hundreds of thousands of Celtic Britons. A lot of Irish, a lot of Scotch-Irish, a lot of Scottish. And they're the ones that they do one of two things. This first wave is going to skip past the seaboard and go to the Appalachians. They're going to be your frontier people. And they're feisty and they're clannish and they love to fight. And they're good for this backwoods area. So you have that group of people. Most of the immigrants were young. Most of them were single. Over half were under 25. Most were male. Most were poor. And most came as labor. The average age in the colonies in 1790 was 16 years old. It was a very young group. And y'all are young, and y'all are all about, I would say y'all are all about the same age. But as you grow, as you age, or if you work with older people or different age groups of people, you'll realize that age actually does play a role in how a group functions. Younger people, particularly if you have a group of young males, tend to be a little more willing to take risk. I'd like to say they would be stupider, but that's not actually the nicest way to put that. But if you get a group of guys together, they're going to do something stupid. It's just part of them. It's part of that age. It's part of. But you take that same group of guys and the ones who live, and look at them 20 years later. Then they're telling the story, the hold my beer stories. About when they were young and did stuff stupid, but they don't do this stuff anymore. So having a young society makes it a little different than one that's more mixed or older. You have people who are, one, healthier and stronger, usually. They're more willing to take risks. You know, that frontal cortex in your brain has not completely developed yet that tells you, no, you're not 10 foot tall and bulletproof. And that if you jump off that cliff, it might hurt when you land. So you have a group that's more willing to take risks. But they also don't have the benefit of age and looking back on, oh yeah, when I jumped off that cliff, it really hurt and I shouldn't do that again. But you have this group of young, and mostly men. Women are going to come over, but in the beginning, particularly in the southern colonies, young single male. You also have convicts that come over. We talked about how Georgia was a penal colony. That's not the only place convicts went. There were certain crimes in England that if you agreed to get on a ship and leave, you could escape the hangman's noose. And a lot of people took that option. You know, sure, I'll try my luck in this new world, or in Australia, or in any of the other colonies that they sent convicts to. But you have a lot of people, most from the British Isle. Talked about that, a lot of indentured servants. So we've got that. And they come over, and there's already a group of people here. Okay, great. Now I'm finding notes. We're not there yet. Okay. And we've talked about this too. The Native Americans were not, you know, the live in harmony with nature that a lot of times we portray them as. They did have a lot of spiritual beliefs that tied to nature. They did believe that land was communal, that it was not something you owned, you just used it, and then you left it for somebody else. That's going to be a major source of conflict between the Indians and the Europeans, who see land as something you own. It's yours. Nobody else can touch it. I'm the only one that can use this. It's mine. But they weren't necessarily ecologically friendly. And one historian has said that early America, the actions of the Indians in early America formed the greatest known loss of wild species. They would overhunt. They would burn to clear land rather than chop down trees. They would completely change the landscape. Some of it's good. You know, if you do regular burns, a regular burn doesn't necessarily destroy a forest. And we're starting to understand that now. Like some trees, sequoias, they have to have a burn period before the seeds will germinate. Burning clears the undergrowth. It puts nutrients back in the soil. It also destroys a lot of things. So it's not horrible, but it's also not great. Burning allowed them to claim cropland, made for travel easier, because if you burn off all the underbrush in the forest, you can walk through it a whole lot easier. If the underbrush is gone, other things start growing, which gives forage for elk, deer, turkey, moose, bear, whatever. It adds the nutrients to the soil for crops. If you add forage, then you have more hunting, which then you can overhunt. Like I think we almost kill off the beaver. In this area, we kill off the antelope. There's a lot that's going on. Now, the Europeans that were coming in, and most of the Indian tribes, now some of them were sedentary, where they would have and it was usually the ones that were more agricultural, where they didn't move around a lot. But a lot of the Indian tribes were, even if they were agricultural, were also migratory or nomadic. They would move from place to place. The Europeans, I have on here that they're not migratory, but they, in a sense, are. They move across the ocean to set up homes and villages and towns with the intention of staying in one place. But people who are willing to go across the ocean to begin with are not people who are going to necessarily stay in one place. And when you use up the soil in one place, it's a lot more tempting just to move on than it is to do something to fix that. They use the timber. They incorporate a lot of the Indian crops, the corn, beans, and squash. You would plant the three together because the corn would support the beans, and the squash would keep, the big squash leaves would keep the roots cool, kind of like a mulch. And the three grow well together. That's part of that accommodation. They learned, and the Indians taught. The Europeans also brought in domesticated animals, which is a problem. In part because some domesticated animals, like hogs, don't have natural enemies. And if you don't keep them contained, feral hogs are an issue. We think it's a modern issue, but it's been an issue since the first Spanish explorers hit the Caribbean. There's whole islands that are overrun with little suckers. But the Europeans didn't contain their animals. In Europe, a lot of times, animals were left to graze. You'd have a shepherd or a herdsman that would keep up with them. Well, when you get over to the New World, the labor issue is a problem. And a lot of animals just go wild. Well, a cow isn't going to care whether a cornfield belongs to an Indian or a settler. They're going to eat. Hogs don't care about anything. They're going to go where they want. So you have clashes where these domesticated animals are overrunning other people's property, other people's farms. Even though the Indians they were using it, it's theirs at the moment. It's not, they don't understand ownership necessarily, but they do understand your cow's in my field and is eating all my corn and I want it gone. So you have another conflict. The Europeans also plant differently from the Indians. They plant surplus crops. And there is a point where it is subsistence farming, where you're planting and eating everything you grow. But pretty soon, Europeans get to the point, because this is the goal. This is what you did in Europe. You plant enough that you can sell it and make some money. They go into commercial fishing. Catch more fish than you need so you can sell them. This is another area of conflict. They're taking more from the land than they necessarily need, but they do need it. They just need it for not survival, in the sense that the Indians understand survival. Um, as we've talked, the first few years were tough, but pretty quickly the colonies get established where growth is possible. By 1750, the population of all of the colonies together has passed 1 million. 25 years later, they've more than doubled that to 2.5 million. And being in the colonies is pretty nice. It's got a better standard of living than most of Europe. The death rate was lower, in part, as Benjamin Franklin points out, in the colonies, land was plentiful and labor was scarce, which is the exact opposite of Europe, where land is scarce. You've had hundreds of years of people claiming it. Labor was more than plentiful. You have beggars in the streets looking for jobs. You have people that they've thrown off the farms for enclosure, so that you've got plenty of labor. But in the colonies, it's the other way around. Land was plentiful, so people could get what they needed. Now, the winters were colder, but they did have more wood because they had all these virgin forests. It was easier to stay warm. You have a younger population, which we've talked about, less susceptible to disease, in part for social distancing because land was plentiful, people spread out. That's going to change as cities start to grow and people start moving closer together. But initially, you had that. You also have a greater proportion of married people and people who marry younger. So the average age in Europe was 25 to 26 for a woman to marry. The average age of marriage in the colonies was 20 to 22. That's roughly a 4-year difference. That gives you time to have at least 2 more babies during your childbearing years. So you have a younger, more fertile group. You have more families. Now, there is some instability issues because there's more men in the colonies than women. Early on, you needed more men, but you do have a lot of instability. Most women will be married, not all the men will. There were, 2 to 3 men per woman. In the South, it averaged out to be a 1 to 8, like 1 woman for every 8 men. So you have some family instability. You have bachelors, people who never marry, or men who never marry, can't pass on the family name, can't pass on whatever it is that they have accomplished as far as building a farm or setting things up. You also have some infidelity issues. You have family instability in that when a husband died, most women would remarry because there's plenty of men around who are willing to take her on. It was almost easier to remarry. But so you have that. But at least in the English colonies, you have more women. The French and the Spanish didn't stress families. And without women, you can't have a natural growth rate. It's just impossible. So You have little babies being born in the colonies, which adds to the population. They're going to grow up there. They're going to contribute. So you have a better growth rate. Life for women in the colonies was, dang it, I keep finding things. Okay. Lost my train of thought. A lot of the same preconceived notions about men and women came across the ocean. Men and women didn't forget halfway across the voyage that, they had grown up with the idea that women were the weaker sex, that men ruled the world and women were supposed to serve their man. These are very firmly rooted ideas that come across the ocean with the settlers. Now, there are going to be some issues that come up, but that is still the basic premise under which most people operate. Deeply rooted convictions of the inferiority of women, weaker sex. Their role was to obey and serve their husbands, nurture their children, and maintain the household. Social and legal customs prevented women from voting, from preaching, from holding office, attending public schools and colleges, bringing lawsuits, making contracts, and owning property. There are exceptions, like Quakers allowed women to preach, but for the most part, women were considered the property of their husbands. Once they were married, they were considered the property of their fathers before that. But there's going to be some challenges in the colonies. Like I said, death rate's pretty high. Accidents happen. People die. Women become widows. And there are many, many instances where women practice the same job that their husband did after his death or even before his death. There are women who will be tavern owners. There are women who will be doctors. There are women who will run plantations. There are women who, by circumstance, will have to take on the male role without, now I'm not going to say that without judgment, because there was definitely going to be judgment, but it was allowed. And it wasn't, at least immediately, squished. So women in the colonies are finding themselves a little bit better off than some of the women in Europe, because there are at least circumstantial instances where you might have a little more freedom, where you could be the one in charge. Within religion, Quakers allowed women to preach, and religion is one of those odd things. Most churches have a higher female membership than male. That's been historic throughout all time. Up to a point, a feminized church was considered a weak and dying church. If you had a lot more women than you had men. But then Cotton Mather turns that around. And he's one of those Puritans that comes across. That childbirth, instead of being a punishment from God, drove women to God. And then having women in the church was actually a strength and not a weakness. It's, again, one of those social constructs to fix the perception that if you have more women than men, your church is weak. But in the colonies, that was one of the issues. African women had it a little bit differently. Traditionally, in Africa, men and women both led their religion. A lot of the African tribes were matriarchal, meaning the women were in charge to begin with. A lot of the African tribes allowed women to be considered equal to men, and they bring this over with them. Now, they're going to be excluded from Christian church membership by most of the colonies. And so when you talk about slavery, slavery is one of those weird, it's a very complicated issue. And then when you add religion to it, it gets even more complicated. The fear was that Christianized slaves would then use Christianity to argue that they shouldn't be slaves. Which, if you're a good Christian and that argument would hold, then why would you have a slave to begin with? But we don't want to think about those things we don't want to think about. So we'll just not let the Africans become Christian. Now, they're going to adopt a lot of the Christian religions, just as a lot of the Southerners are going to adopt a lot of the African traditions. Women did a lot of work in the colony. I mean, think about what your moms do at home. There's a little rhyme. Men may work from sun to sun, but women's work is never done. You know, tradition states that the men go out, they work the fields, they come in, and they're done for the day. Knock that forward 400 years in the 1950s, men go out, they do their 8 to 5 job, they come home, they're done for the day. It's only probably been in the last 50 years that we've started to change some of those ideas. The house, the garden, the yard, I should have put, and the children were the main focus for women. Usually a woman would get up at 4 in the morning to prepare breakfast by 5:30. She would water the livestock, wake the children, churn the butter, garden, make lunch. And this is not just slap a sandwich together. This is cook something on an open hearth with the bread that you made over the weekend. So cook lunch, play with the kids, probably garden some more, make dinner, milk a cow, clean the kitchen. When she had time, she would comb, spin, and spool, weave, and bleach wool for clothing. She would knit linen, make cotton, or which you do the same way as wool, you have to spin it and all that. Sew up sheets, quilts, which means you have to weave the fabric first. She would be the one to make candles and soap. She would be the one usually to chop wood, which is always portrayed as a man's job, but in reality it really wasn't. Haul water, mop the floors, wash the clothes. Now, as your children started getting old enough, they would help mama. And we're talking old enough as probably 5. So kids got put to work pretty early. If nothing else, they could watch the other children. And children were your free labor. You know, even if you had an indentured servant, that contract comes with a little bit of money. There's an investment there. Children are just yours. You can do what you want with them. So the more children you have, the more labor you have. But like I said, there were some opportunities. Tavern hostess, shopkeepers, doctors, printers, upholsterers. Most often as widows carrying on their husband's trade. Then, of course, there was always the oldest profession. Prostitution thrived in the colonies just like it thrived everywhere else. of course, it was frowned upon. And if you were found out or caught, you could be publicly whipped. They called them bawdy houses or disorderly houses. They will raid them frequently. A lot of, even though prostitution was frowned upon, it was never completely driven out. And some slave women who were forced into situations they didn't want to be would use that to well, if you're going to treat me like one, you're going to pay me like one, to demand compensation. It didn't always work, but at least it was an attempt. But for all of this, for all of the work, for all of the inferiority, women in the colonies were probably more highly valued than they were elsewhere in the world. There were laws created to protect them from abuse, which was unheard of anywhere else. There were laws that allowed for divorce in certain situations. And there were laws that allowed for them to have greater control of property that they brought into a marriage. Normally, if you were the only daughter of a squire and he died and you inherited everything as the only heir, as soon as you married, you were now no longer the owner of that property. But in the colonies, that changed a little bit, and people and women were allowed more control over their property. All right, let's talk about the southern colonies a little bit more. Y'all done with this page? All right. As I mentioned before, climate is an advantage. There's enough rain, enough fertile land, enough open land that market crops can be easily grown once they figured out what the good market crops were. Tobacco, rice, cotton, trees, of course, they're already there. They just have to be harvested. Cattle. Indigo is going to be one that we talk about. And indigo is one of those that that's actually, we could talk about that with women again. Can't remember Elizabeth Lucas was the daughter of a planter. And she had grown up in Barbados on a plantation and had seen indigo growing wild. Now, indigo can be used to make a blue dye, which is very important. They moved to, I can't remember if it's Virginia or South Carolina, but they moved to the southern colonies. Daddy has to go away, and she's left to run 3 plantations with slaves. She's left behind to take care of, her mother is ailing, and she's left behind to take care of everything. Well, while Daddy is gone, she decides to plant indigo, and it takes off like nobody's business. And the indigo industry in America is started, and it started by a woman. But so you can add indigo to the market crops. The colonies have a favorable trade with England through much of the early years, 1690s through 1720s. But a lot of this is going to be taken up by, okay, I have a more precise date up there, by middlemen. And this is going to be an issue for the South up until the Civil War, and really even after the Civil War. But it's going to be one of the issues that's going to help lead us to the Civil War. Southerners grew the crops, but people from the middle colonies or from New England had the ships that took them across the ocean. They had the storage. They had the banks. They had the insurance companies. You had to pay customs. All of these payments are going to cut in to the profit. Not only that, land was plentiful, labor was scarce. If you can't get adequate labor, you have to buy labor. They bought it in the form of slaves. Slaves were an investment. Slaves represented money, but it also ties up capital. But the South does benefit by having the ability for large-scale production, a plentiful labor, plentiful and ready market. Like I said, labor was initially indentured servants, but it's going to be slaves later. Not all indentured servants were voluntary. This is where we get the word kidnapped. So there was an underground trade in what they called kids and spirits. So you're kidnapped or spirited away. Basically, you go to a bar, somebody conks you on the back of the head, and you wake up the next day on a ship bound for the colonies. Not your choice. You're basically being sold into slavery, but it's not slavery. There is an indenture. Convicts would come across, escape the noose by relocating to the colonies. And then you did have the African slaves. Now, an indenture could own property, but could not engage in trade. They could marry, but only with their master's permission. Runaways could be hunted down and punished. You could basically do anything to them except kill them. You could be whipped or have your indenture extended for bad behavior. A lot of indentured servants will die in the colonies from exposure, from exhaustion. Hoeing tobacco in the humid Virginia sun is backbreaking work. But if you survived, you would get your freedom dues, which were set by custom and laws and include money, tools, clothing, food, and sometimes even land. Most indentured servants came over. You indenture yourself because you're poor to begin with. Most will end up being poor afterwards. But there are some that go on very well to do. By 1629, 7 members of the Virginia legislature had been former indentured servants. So it was possible to come across and do well. Others, not so much. Some, like Benjamin Franklin's grandmother, she married the man who originally bought her services. Now, he bought her services as a servant, not as a prostitute, but he brought her over as an indentured servant, fell in love, and they got married. And that happened. Slaves, on the other hand, were not as free to do what they want. By 1619 is when they first start bringing slaves over. But during the 18th century, so during the 1700s, there's going to be three times more African American and Indian slaves than there are going to be free immigrants in the colonies. So 3 out of 4 people that you meet are either going to be an Indian or an African slave in these southern colonies. At first, they were treated as indentured servants. I think I mentioned that once before. Some of these will gain their freedom, and they'll also acquire slaves. Slave ownership was not limited by race. And race is not at first the defining factor of a slave. You could be a slave no matter what your color. But pretty soon, and it's gradual, color becomes the custom in the law, and partly because it's easy. But by 1660, lifelong slavery and African slavery is codified. And it's codified not just in the Americas, or not just in the North American colonies, but in all of the colonies. Both the French and the English West Indies and Portugal, Brazil took in slaves. They actually get 95% of all the slaves that come out of Africa will go to the West Indies. And if this doesn't sound like, a bonus, but if there was a bonus to this, being a slave in the American Southern colonies was a whole lot better than being a slave in the West Indies. They literally worked people to death. The South offered the greatest chance of survival and the greatest chance of natural increase. Slaves were allowed to marry. Later on, it's going to be made illegal for slaves to marry, but slaves still married. It was most slave owners would allow family units. And there's a practical reason to that. If you're single and you want to escape, you don't have to worry about you. But if you're married and you have a child, things suddenly get a whole lot more complicated. And as your master, I now have something to use over you. I have leverage. You don't do what I want, I'm going to hurt your kid. So it was beneficial. Also, on the more positive side of this, a happy slave was a happy person's easier to work with than an unhappy person. And if you're happy in a marriage, that made things easier as well. But at first, they're still kind of working out all of these issues. But the demand is going to grow in the South as the economy grew. All of the colonies, North and South, recognize slavery. In fact, New York is going to have the highest slave servant population of all of the cities. South Carolina is the only colony that's going to have a black majority to begin with, but all of the colonies recognize slavery. All right, we will talk more about slavery next time, and I will get my life organized. And you two that came in late, be sure you sign in. So what should we be praying?